Hello, I'm Doug Wentz, and welcome to Make Moderates Matter. This is the second video for my channel, and as I promised in my first video, I'd like to share a bit more about my political background. Stay tuned. Welcome back. In my first video, I outlined what I'm trying to accomplish with this channel. If you've not yet watched that introduction, I encourage you to do so. But in sum, I have three main goals. First, to review what it means to be a political moderate. Second, to consider how we can make moderates matter, whether through political parties and organizations, including the moderate factions within the Republican and Democratic parties, the Forward Party, No Labels, or the moderate parties emerging in some states like the New Jersey Moderate Party and United Kansas, or by changing the structure and mechanics of the voting process, such as through proportional representation, ranked choice voting, fusion voting, open primaries, independent redistricting commissions to combat gerrymandering, or a combination of the above, like the Fair Representation Act. And finally, my third goal is to provide general news and updates about political moderates in America. But before I expand on all those topics, I want to share a bit more about my political background and why I decided to start this channel. I first got involved in politics in the late 1970s when I was a 19-year-old junior at Cornell University. A registered Republican at the time, I was living for the summer with my parents at our home in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, and had a summer job at a bank in nearby Harrisburg, the capital of Pennsylvania. The state capitol building was literally about 3 blocks down the street from where I worked, and I soon became immersed in state politics. In particular, I assembled a collection of articles on the critical topic of the summer, the problem of political corruption in Pennsylvania. My collection included, for example, an article by David Broder in the Washington Post in May of 1978, which noted that in the last 8 years, according to one calculation, 239 public officials in Pennsylvania had been indicted for crimes against the public trust. And know that 239 figure was not a mistake. As my collection of articles could attest, and a subsequent article by Teresa Bonner of Penn Live Patriot News summarized, about 60 people under Governor Milton Schaap, including 4 cabinet members, were convicted in the 1970s of fraud, extortion, and other crimes. For example, House Speaker Herbert Feynman, a Philadelphia Democrat, was convicted in 1977 of buying votes and taking kickbacks for passing legislation. And Senate Appropriations Committee Chairman Henry Buddy Cianfrani, another Democrat from Philadelphia, was convicted in 1977 of taking kickbacks and putting his girlfriend on the payroll even though she never worked. Although Governor Schaap himself was never indicted, the situation was so bad that his administration was jokingly referred to as the Crook of the Month Club. Now, I can't say why all this struck a nerve with me, but it did. Corruption not only undermines democracy, but also erodes the moral fabric of society in a way that I find particularly disturbing. And of course, political corruption has the practical effect of diverting my hard-earned tax dollars away from real public needs like education and infrastructure and into the hands of politicians. For example, as several articles in my collection could attest, and a subsequent article by Brad Bumstead in Penn Live Patriot News noted, in 1978, former Pennsylvania Turnpike Commissioner Egidio Sorelli was convicted for extorting money from contractors to make contributions to the Democratic Party. But what really concerned me about all this was that the voting public didn't seem to care. Hardly a day went by without yet another indictment, but the general consensus seemed to be that political corruption was just the time-honored way of doing business in Pennsylvania. So with that in mind, I did what any impulsive 19-year-old college student who perhaps should have known better would do. I walked down the street from my job at the bank in Harrisburg to the front steps of the Pennsylvania State Capitol building and attempted a Guinness World Record for the longest continuous political speech. That's right. On August 23rd and 24th of 1978, I spoke for 31 continuous hours on the front steps of the Pennsylvania State Capitol building with the topic, Pennsylvania's Corrupt State Government, Why Don't You Care? Now, I have to say up front that despite speaking for 31 hours and thinking that I had broken the Guinness World Record of 30 hours, I later learned that I did not in fact break the record. Incredibly and unbeknownst to me, someone else spoke for 32 hours, 1 hour longer than me, shortly before my attempt. Go figure. But for me, the fact that I didn't break the record was beside the point. The point was that I had my say, and the reaction to my speech was more than I expected. Stories about my speech appeared at least 5 times on the front pages of the Harrisburg Patriot and Evening News and the nearby Carlisle Sentinel. The first article by reporter John Scottson ran in the Harrisburg Evening News a full week before my speech and noted that a teen is talking of a new record. 3 days later, Jim Kirchner of the Carlisle Sentinel wrote an article reporting my plans to speak 30 hours against corruption. Then on August 23rd, the day of my speech, Harrisburg Patriot News ran a front-page story reporting that my marathon talk aims at graft. Cal Turner of the Evening News followed up that night with another front-page article reporting that Wentz talks way to record, Collegian lashes out at political corruption. And finally, after I finished my speech, the Carlisle Sentinel ran an editorial saying I deserved a standing ovation. The editorial board noted, tongue-in-cheek, that it was significant that I chose corruption as my topic, since the source for my material was, sad to say, enormous. Now, all of this attention was a bit of a surprise, but I knew would be short-lived. In fact, just 1 week later, I was back in college for the fall semester, and the political situation in Pennsylvania seemed far away. As the years passed, however, I grew increasingly determined to do something more concrete about the problem of political corruption in Pennsylvania. I wanted to make sure that my time on the Capitol steps would not be remembered, if you'll pardon the pun, as just a lot of hot air. So in the years that followed, I completed my BA at Cornell and earned both a master's degree in public policy analysis at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia and a law degree at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. And while in law school, I worked part-time at the American Bar Association, also known as the ABA, on its Model Procurement Code project. The Model Procurement Code was completed in 1979 and was designed to enable states and cities to modernize their procurement practices and minimize the opportunities for favoritism and corruption. For example, all bidders and contractors were given the right to have their grievances heard in court in the same manner as parties to commercial contracts, which helped to eliminate backdoor under-the-table maneuvers and political manipulations. The ABA's Model Procurement Code gradually met with success. By 1984, at least 10 states had enacted public contracting statutes based on the ABA's Model Code. And most significantly for me, a version of the code was introduced in Pennsylvania. To that end, I lobbied for adoption of the code and published an op-ed in the Philadelphia Inquirer to promote the code and other anti-corruption measures. Along the way, I also drafted several chapters of the ABA's Guide on Identifying and Prosecuting Fraud and Abuse in State and Local Contracting. The guide provided prosecutors with a concise working reference about the procurement process to assist in the recognition, prosecution, and prevention of procurement fraud and abuse. After graduating from law school, I left my job at the ABA and returned to Philadelphia, where I started a career as a corporate and securities lawyer with a Center City law firm. I also at that time became involved with Republican politics. I was elected a Republican committeeman for the district where I lived near Independence Hall, and campaigned for Republican U.S. Senator Arlen Specter. Specter was a fellow graduate of the University of Pennsylvania and a former district attorney from Philadelphia who championed my efforts to combat political corruption. He also was widely regarded as a moderate centrist and ended up representing Pennsylvania for 30 years. And finally, at this time, I also campaigned for and had the pleasure of meeting President George H.W. Bush. But despite all this, and while some felt I had a bright future as a politician, I gradually became disillusioned with politics. I found it frustrating, for example, that despite everything I had done to promote the ABA's Model Procurement Code, the legislation remained stalled in the Pennsylvania General Assembly. Ultimately, too, as the years went by, I became disillusioned with the Republican Party. I had always considered myself to be a political moderate, but watched with dismay as Republican leaders became increasingly more inflexible on issues like gun control, despite repeated mass shootings. Eventually, then, I decided against a career in politics and focused instead on practicing law. For personal reasons, too, I relocated to Florida, where I transitioned from private practice to a career as an in-house corporate and securities lawyer with several large corporations. In those roles, among other things, I helped to implement company ethics and compliance programs, which dovetailed nicely with my intellectual interest in corruption, but a politician I was not. It was during this time, too, during the Iraq War, that I became so disenchanted with the Republican Party that I decided to change my registration. So, too, in fact, did my mentor, Arlen Specter, who left the Republican Party in 2009 and switched to become a Democrat. I myself couldn't quite bring myself to do the same, but changed my registration instead to independent, which is where I stand today. Finally, then, in 2023, at the age of 65, I retired from the practice of law and genuinely believed that my days of public speaking and political activism were long behind me. At least that was until just 6 months later, when Donald Trump once again ran for president. Now, it's hard to describe how I felt at the time, but suffice it to say that I was deeply disappointed. While I no longer was a Republican, I could not quite believe that the party I once supported would nominate for president a convicted felon who attempted to overturn the results of the 2020 election, and whose first administration was marred by corruption, grift, and seemingly endless conflicts of interest. The whole situation felt like an incredible twist of fate. 46 years earlier, while still in college, I spoke on the front steps of the Pennsylvania State Capitol about the problem of political corruption and did my best to promote the ABA's Model Procurement Code to combat fraud and abuse in state government contracting. And now, at the end of my career, just as I retired, the problem of political corruption once again was a critical issue, and my original home state of Pennsylvania was the focus of attention. In fact, multiple outlets, including U.S. News & World Report, NPR, and The Hill, regarded Pennsylvania as a critical swing state, perhaps the critical swing state that ultimately could sway the entire 2024 presidential election. So with that in mind, you perhaps can guess what I decided to do next. That's right. I returned to Harrisburg and delivered a second speech on the front steps of the Pennsylvania State Capitol building. On September 25th of 2024, just 6 weeks before the 2024 presidential election, I returned to the very same spot on the Capitol steps in Harrisburg where I delivered my original speech 46 years earlier, and delivered a second speech, this time entitled, Donald Trump's January 6th Insurrection and Endless Corruption. Why Don't You Care? Alas, by now in my 60s, another 30-hour speech was not in the cards. But in just 2.5 hours that day, over the noon lunch hour, I once again had my say. My speech consisted of 2 parts. In the first part, I reminded listeners of the violent attack on the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, and Donald Trump's nearly successful attempt to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election. And in the second part, I presented a Donald Trump corruption timeline that summarized Trump's history of grift, corruption, and unethical conduct over many years. I would like to share more details from my speech for the record, but it's far more than I can cover here. Instead, I will leave that for my next 2 videos, which I encourage you to watch if I've perked your interest. For now, I'll just note that my speech was covered by reporter Jan Murphy from Penn Live Patriot News in an article on September 25th, where she noted that I had returned to the very same spot on the Capitol steps where I first had spoken against corruption 46 years earlier. In addition, a few days later on September 30, I followed up my speech and published an op-ed with Penn Live Patriot News entitled, Trump and Perry are not patriots. My grandmother was. In that article, I noted that Republican Congressman Scott Perry, who represented Pennsylvania's 10th Congressional District that includes my original hometown of Mechanicsburg, had a campaign website, Patriots for Perry, but argued that Trump and Perry's involvement with the violent attack on the U.S. Capitol on January 6 was hardly patriotic. Instead, in my view, my own grandmother, who started the Meals on Wheels program in Mechanicsburg, was more truly patriotic. I'll have more to say about that op-ed and my view of patriotism in a later video. Alas, as we all now know, the 2024 election did not turn out as I had hoped. Donald Trump not only carried Pennsylvania, but also once again was elected president. Which brings me to this channel. Twice before in my life, I was not content to simply watch as events unfolded, which resulted in my first speech on the Capitol steps in Harrisburg in 1978 and my second speech in September of 2024 before the November presidential election. And now, with Donald Trump sitting in the Oval Office, I once again feel compelled to act. And with that in mind, I have started this channel and my related website at makemoderatesmatter.com. But there's an important point I want to emphasize. The purpose of this channel is not to catalog Donald Trump's transgressions. I had my say about Donald Trump in my 2024 speech on the Capitol steps, and while I plan to present a condensed version of my speech for the record in my next two videos, Trump will not be my focus after that. Instead, as I noted in my first video, if a third of Americans, as reported by Gallup, or maybe even most Americans, according to Anthony Fowler, are political moderates, and yet, as reported by the Pew Research Center, partisan polarization in Congress has increased, then my aim will be to empower moderation in American politics. My aim, as I noted earlier, will be to review what it means to be a political moderate, and how we can make moderates matter, whether through political parties and organizations, or by changing the structure and mechanics of the voting process. Finally, I have to say that because I consider myself to be a political moderate, I want to live the moderate values that I summarized in my first video. One of those values, as I noted, is that in my view, political moderates want to work together respectfully with people of different viewpoints to reach practical, sensible solutions to our problems. I myself did not vote for Donald Trump, but realized that many moderates did, or he would not have been elected. And suffice it to say that I don't hate these Trump supporters. I realize that politics is about making choices, and if some moderates chose Trump over Kamala Harris, then I respect that decision, which was absolutely their right as voters. But with that in mind, I also want to consider why these moderates may have voted for Trump, and how we all can nevertheless work together going forward to make moderates matter. So my plan is this. In my next two videos, episodes 3 and 4, I will present a condensed version of my speech on the Capitol steps in Harrisburg before the 2024 election, with episode 3 covering the January 6th insurrection, and episode 4 presenting my Donald Trump corruption timeline. I continue to feel that this information is important and should not be forgotten, so we'll preserve it for the record. Having said that, however, in episode 5, I will move on to consider why, despite everything I covered in my speech, some moderates nevertheless voted for Trump, and how, regardless, we can all work together going forward to make moderates matter. And spoiler alert, in my view, Donald Trump didn't win the 2024 election so much as Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, and the Democrats lost it. And the reason they lost is because they failed to appeal to moderate voters by moving to the center on key issues like the economy and immigration. I'll have more to say about that in episode 5. So that's where I'm at. I am not a politician and am not running for office. I am a 60-something retiree, political moderate, and registered independent who cares deeply about this country and is convinced that now more than ever, we need to make moderates matter in our political lives. If you're inclined to agree and are curious to learn more, I encourage you to please subscribe to this channel, watch my next video, episode 3, about the January 6th insurrection, and visit my website at makemoderatesmatter.com. Thanks for watching.